Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. I am Siseko Kumalo, your host, a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program and a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. Today I'm joined by my colleague and brother, Darian Pollock, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Boston University. Darian is a graduate of Morehouse College, where he majored in philosophy and concentrated in leadership studies at the Andrew Young Center for Global Research. During his doctoral studies in the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, the core of his research centered on the development of a philosophical method that he calls street philosophy. In addition to his work as an academic philosopher, Darian is the founder and president of the Street Philosophy Institute Incorporated, SPI, a Massachusetts-based think tank dedicated to promoting research in the areas of public philosophy and civic engagement. Darian has published with Philosophical Issues on the question of political action, Epistemic Detachment, and the Problem of White-mindedness. His ongoing research explores topics like the street is not a metaphor, contestation, and the margins of discourse. And he recently presented a paper at Princeton University where he spoke on self-determination, Kinship Networks, and the possibility of an international Black Commonwealth. Darren, before we get started with the prepared questions, would you care to just share a bit about us, about yourself with us and our audience? Specifically, I'm fascinated, or I'm intrigued and interested in your studies, specifically here at Harvard in the philosophy department, which is an exciting department, but one that, in consultation with colleagues in the department, has not had an African philosophy specialist since Kwame Anthony Appiah in 1997. So I'm interested and curious about your experience in the department.
Yeah, man. First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me on this forum. It's a pleasure. It's an honor being in the presence of such I don't know, you're such a deep colleague, and you care deep. I say deep in terms of intellectual, but deep also in terms of empathy. You have a caring spirit. So I'm really appreciative to be able to have this conversation with you in particular. So, long story short, I'm from the rural south of the southern United States, from a small town called Marianna, Florida. Mm-hmm. The town is only really known in the history of the mind of the world, I guess, for a big mass public lynching that happened in 1934, I believe, by the name of Claude Neal. He was a black man who was lynched by a mob. And so the reason I tell that story is because that is the culture I'm from. Mm-hmm. That's the racial culture I'm from. And so I end up, that always shaped the way I thought about race in this country. Mm-hmm. And then as I grew older, I was able to compare my experience with others from different parts of the diaspora and also the continent. Yeah. But when I went to Morehouse, it was, that cultural consciousness turned into a political consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I studied at Morehouse. And to be honest with you, just to the honest, I didn't like school. Mm-hmm. I didn't like school. And so I came to Morehouse not really liking school, but wanting to know the truth. Yeah. And so right before I was thinking about dropping out, one of my comrades, I call them comrades, friends, DeAndre Swells, shout out to DeAndre Swells, now going to be a professor at Clemson University. Mm-hmm. He said, bro, before you drop out, man, you should think about taking a philosophy course. Mm-hmm. And I did. And so I took a philosophy course, and more or less I studied under this professor who actually did his PhD at Boston University, where I'm at now as a mm-hmm. professor, but spent 30 years in Nigeria working on African philosophy. Okay. So that's when I first got exposed to African philosophy. But unfortunately, when I wanted to do the PhD at Harvard, I had to some ways do a project that had the same spirit of the things I cared about, problems of race and stuff like that. But I had to, code it a little bit. And we're going to talk about that, my whole concept of white-mindedness and the intelligibility of things.
Yeah. So, and I suppose that's the whole point of coming into these spaces and specifically doing philosophy is that we're having to treat questions and concerns that we care about, but of course in a language that is legible to the history of the discipline, but also how the discipline has been arranged. And just as an aside to that, the reason why I say tell us a bit about yourself is because, for the folks watching, before we got started, I said to you, you're reminding, like, your aesthetic kind of gives me the vibe of a young Cornel West.
I was blessed.
You know what I mean? So I just wanted to kind of...
Shout out Cornel.
to sort of try and find, what are the commonalities, right? Because specifically, your work sort of intersects in very, very interesting ways with some of the work that he's also thinking about vis-a-vis blackness, vis-a-vis race. But I wanted to go back to, that anecdote that you gave us at the beginning, which is to say that you come from this particular small rural town with this historic moment of public lynching. One of the experiences that I've often had in the United States is to say that, yes, I come from South Africa, and South Africa is a deeply divided and racial society, but there are challenges that I encounter in the United States because of the racial history of this country that often kind of leave me, without the tools maybe to kind of navigate this space. So I'm curious about, that particular history that you mentioned of your geographical location and what that does for you in terms of sort of bringing you into philosophy and the kinds of questions that you then interrogate in philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. So I'm going to give you a little personal aphorism or saying that I say. So I always tell people, in New England, in particular, Harvard, Boston, I feel safe, but I don't feel comfortable. Culturally, I feel away from my people. We talked about this. You miss speaking your language. We have, the black. I call it black English, black vernacular. In some ways, if you don't have a white-minded interpretation of natural language, it is its own kind of natural language. We don't even talk with words. We talk with our hands. And so I miss that. So, but I also say though, in the South, in the rural South particularly, I feel comfortable, but I don't feel safe. And so that's the difference. Where it's like, growing up where I grew up, as a black person, you always have to be on guard. But not so in terms of there's different interpretations of protection. You have to protect yourself when you're driving, thinking about how to protect yourself, if just in case you get pulled over by a cop, or if just in case you get flagged down by a random white person. But also in the classroom. My grandmother protected me. And I have a twin brother. She protected us from mostly racist, white-minded, and white supremacist, women teachers, because just white women are overrepresented in education. But also when it comes to sports, to see how the black male body in particular is treated still as chattel. And I'm referencing work of Tommy Curry and The Man Not, and how he talks about how these vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow are still with us through the practices, and it's very vivid in the rural South to this day.
And that's interesting that you say that because, just the other day, last week, we were having a very interesting conversation with, a photographer and an artist, and the concept that comes up is this notion of the ways in which blackness is consumed across geography and space, right? So the work of Bell Hooks comes to mind, where she thinks of when she thinks of this concept of consuming the other, whether that is through black labor, whether that is through black music, black culture, whether it is through the black body on the athletics track or in basketball, et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting that you mentioned that as part and parcel of that response. But I'm curious then about, and this is again, I'm about to get into sort of the meat of our discussion, but I'm curious about your engagement in view of that with the notion of racial capital, right? Global racial capitalism. How are you thinking about that? How does, coming from the from the rural South in the context of the United States, where on one hand one mightn't necessarily see the vivid hand of racial capitalism, but on the other hand, the Deep South is predicated on black labor, right? The notion of racial capitalism really is born on the factory, on the cotton plantations out in the deep south here in the United States, and that culture still kind of plays itself out. I recently visited the state of Alabama in Huntsville, and I was so fascinated by the kind of different cultural approaches. So I was at Huntsville, University of Huntsville, Alabama, and I was hosted by a colleague of mine, a white colleague in the philosophy department. And so his wife and I go and grab lunch, and it was very fascinating the kind of response that we got from the public. In a quote unquote progressive town like Huntsville that has 3 universities located in the city, you know what I mean? But you still have that sense of curiosity, if I can at least call it that. So I'm curious about the relationship that you have in relation to your work, especially, and how your work attends to questions, for example, of the imbricated nature of global racial capitalism, and how you're thinking about that from the locus of both geography but also biography.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I see it, I think that what comes to mind to me immediately when you talk about this is Sylvia Wynter's incredible essay, No Humans Involved, written in 1993, where she talks about this issue that we're going to have when, with the technological advances and, the outsourcing of labor jobs and this and that, where does black people, particularly undereducated black men, where will we fit into the white-minded culture and sphere? My grandfather he migrated up north, was a pipe layer. Before that, his ancestors, as you say, they were slaves and sharecroppers. And so what I'm saying is, throughout those practices, those are different practices, but they're still labor practices. And so that Sylvia Wynter asked us in that paper, what will happen to the black persons, to the black people, when we're no longer valued for our labor? When you have AI taking over things, what happens to black labor? And I think, so that's one node. And another node is spectatorship. I'm thinking about, Harold Cruz's famous book, Crisis of Negro Intellectual, when he talks about how black culture it's ever since we tried to depart from minstrelsy in this country, we've been exploited by white publishers, by white media things. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I have a question now. We served this role for the white mind for generations, labor roles and spectator roles. When that gives out, I'm thinking about Cavell's phrase, when truth gives out, when that gives out, where do black people fit into this thing? And so I think, I'm not an Afro-pessimist. I don't identify as Afro-pessimist, but one point that I will always defend on behalf of them is that they do have a point when they say that, anti-blackness may be a permanent feature to modernity. I think that's very compelling, but at the same time, I won't go all the way, because I think that that's the point of what we're trying to do, scholarship and organizing, because I think that we still can still show the role that black people can have to play in the future. And I think that's what the philosophical and the social scientific research should be about. It's like, how do we make room for ourselves, call room for our space, when the white mind is trying to kick us out.
And I suppose the real sort of intrigue for me when it comes to the Afro-pessimist tradition, and it's interesting that you mention Afro-pessimism, because I think it's come up 3 times already in the course.
It's a big idea. I got to give them credit.
Absolutely, in the course of the show. One of the curiosities that I have is to say that if indeed anti-blackness is a staying mark or staying feature of modernity, is the sort of next iterative move in the arrangement of social and political worlds a postmodern kind of articulation, and what does, and again, I think postmodernism, not necessarily, because we've seen postmodernism, right, in terms of the literature, and what has come out of postmodernist circles, the critiques that we get from your likes of Judith Butler, your Michel Foucault's, all of those characters. And as an African, in as much as I find myself in the global north today and excitedly returning back to the global south,
I'm right behind you, man. I told you I'm going there this summer too.
I'm curious about a postmodernist world that doesn't necessarily hinge on the postmodernist literary or literature and sort of
Good.
the articulation, right? So what would that, if we take seriously the Afro-pessimist claim, and I'm thinking about this because if we trace the roots of Afro-pessimism, it goes back to sort of the early articulations of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe in South Africa with the PAC, Pan-Africanist Congress, and the Pan-Africanist Congress kind of petitioning, right, for a radically different world. And the problem with that, the challenge rather, not the problem, the challenge that we have is that Sobukwe is kind of taken from us at a very, very early stage, and we don't see the completion of that thought in terms of what does this radically different world look like. So, in as much as you say, we're not necessarily Afro-pessimists, but I'm curious about your own thoughts in terms of what would that postmodern kind of articulation look like.
Well, so first I want to talk about the ontology of the conditions of the looking like. The conditions is, one of the conditions is the theorist has to get the heck out the way. One of the things that we just don't recognize, even with the postmodern literary tradition, is it presupposes a form of individualism, which I track to as a white-minded node, a Western node, and it puts it gives undue credit and undue responsibility to the individual theorist or collection of theorists. So the reason why I don't use the word postmodern is because I use another word. I say we need a street philosophy.
Yes.
And what is a street philosophy? A street philosophy, using Winter's framework, is taking the second sight, to use a Du Bois term, the street disposition, using my term, of what Winter calls liminality, being at the limits of the center, and harnessing that wisdom to create these new imaginations. The theorists, here's the thing about the Afro-pessimists, so I just talk good about them, but I guess I'm gonna critique them now. It's a lot of different personalities in Afro-pessimism. But one thing I do think they have in common is that they, in diagnosing a problem, they stand in the way of the solutions. They stand in the way of speaking on behalf of people who, some of these people that they're trying to speak on behalf of don't even have the conceptual frameworks that they're doing, because they're borrowing these frameworks from Derrida and Foucault, to your point. I was reading Frank Willis's book the other day. He's borrowing a lot of things from post-structuralist, postmodernist white thought. But what if the people we're trying to lead are undereducated, at least the people I'm representing? I'm coming from a situation where, the average black male is dropping out in 8th grade. So they don't even want to hear the word postmodern because it doesn't speak to their lived experience. So the purpose of street philosophy is try to take ordinary language and ordinary experiences at the margins and have that express itself. And the reason the theorist thinks that's not possible is because part of their white-mindedness is thinking that they have to be the vanguard. Marxism has the same problem. Where the vanguard the intellectual has to be the spokesperson for the people. Street philosophy denies that.
Yeah. Is there a possibility, though, Darian, where we allow ourselves as intellectuals, as theorists, to quote-unquote abandon the project? Right, because that seems like a certain sense of saying, okay, we've done enough. Because we really have. We've written about these problems. I work in the decolonial tradition, and we've written about decoloniality for. My work goes all the way back to the work of William Wellington Gopa, who was writing in 1888.
Oh, man.
Right, and he gives me the first, and there are other folks, right, who are writing before him. So the likes of your Tio Soga, the likes of, your John Tengo Jabavus. There are all of these African intellectuals, black intellectuals in the South African context. And we are fortunate enough that by 1823 we have access to the press, and so we have a proliferation of black public intellectual spaces, right, where we're discussing. And if I take seriously their work comes out in 1888. It's been 130 some odd years since that project started.
Yeah.
So we've done. I think that I had another colleague of mine, a senior of mine, Professor Paul Zaleza, and he's an African scholar, and part of what Paul has been pushing and what he's been suggesting, and to a certain extent I'm beginning to agree with him, is that what exactly is it that we're doing, right, when we're writing post-colonial, decolonial philosophy, theory, etc., because we've been doing this stuff. So, it starts in 1888. In the 20th century, there's the Petition for African Independence and Liberation, and we're still continuing with the same conversation. So the point that I'm just getting at, or the question that I want to sort of, get your thoughts on is that even possible? Which will lead me to the work that you're doing on white-mindedness, because I do think that a lot of what makes us believe maybe that it is impossible for us to step aside is that we're invested, as you say, in being the vanguard. But can we just basically shut up and take a seat and say, okay, let the whole thing play itself out?
So,
or what do we do?
I'm going for a more moderate claim. So vanguardism is a form of extremism, so saying that we have to take the role. But also checking out totally, intellectual checking out is, to me, an extreme position. The reason why so I talked a little bit about that first thing, but the other thing about, why we shouldn't step aside is because, if you go back and look at, for example, Harold Cruz's Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, one of the I think, extreme insights for the diaspora and for the continent is what he talks about is all these periods, particularly in the diasporic history, of what he calls the Great Forgettings. Okay, in the 20s, we had the Garveyite movement. I'm talking, particularly in America, the Garveyite movement. But also, what people don't know is in the 20s, the early 20s, the Negro population was the biggest representative constituency in the Communist Party. So, but by the time you get to the late 30s and the 40s, people have forgot. So my thing is that the intellectual one is definitely needed to preserve the history of ideas. So we know, and so you do the digging, but a lot of people, they think they reinventing the wheel. This was the problem. They are reinventing the wheel, and I think this is exhibited in, for example, Black Lives Matter discourse. And the youth, Stokely Carmichael, they talks about how they were mobilized. They were mobilized because, look, just looking around, that's going to get you motivated to act. But in terms of organization, and organization not just in terms of political structure, but intellectual structure. What are the ideas that didn't work that we tried before? So I say this to the Marxists, okay, any black Marxists today, even if they are in the vein of Cedric Robinson, who I quote in this paper, but not his black Marxism stuff, but any black Marxist today who doesn't understand, black communist, who doesn't understand that in the early 20s, you had this big representation of black people who were communists, and Cruz's diagnosis historically why it didn't work out. So that's an example of when a black person first discovers communism, Marxism as a way as a method, thinking that this has to work. Well, look, brother, look, sister, we got evidence in history that we tried it actively and it didn't work for a set of reasons. So even if we want to revive the idea and try it again, it's helpful for the intellectual to teach the reason. So the intellectual is an educator, and the intellectual also is an organizer. So for me, there's three roles. There's the theorist, the organizer, and the participant. A true organizer is always going to be in between the participant and the theorist. So let's take intellectual, the way I see it is like, let's take more intellectuals, theorists, and give them a better political education about how to interact with the public, and so they can help with this stop this great forgetting that's coming around every 20 to 30 years in the continent and diaspora.
And part of that forgetting, I think, comes from the way that we engage and sort of communicate our ideas to the public, right? Because a lot of us, because of the neoliberal university, tend to kind of write for each other, or write for promotion, or we write for the academy. We don't write for the public.
We get into it now. I like how this conversation. You get into it now,
right?
yeah.
We're constantly in this process or in the project of, I suppose, self-legitimation in white spaces, right? Because the academy, whether it be a historically black institution, historically black college or university, or historically black university in the South African context, the academy has always been a white-minded space, which brings me to the work that you do in this paper, wherein you define white-mindedness as a cultural network of various practices, dispositions, frames, and incentives that contribute to the maintenance of certain socio-historical structures of domination. Now, this definition comes from the work that you did on political action, epistemic detachment, and the problem of white-mindedness. I'm interested in this definition because of what you say in your paper that discusses an international black Commonwealth, wherein you suggest that despite their political virtues, black nationalists of the 19th and early 20th century were Eurocentric in their values. Or as you describe the problem, they were white-minded, right? I want to get into that.
Let's do it.
Because that I find that fascinating for a number of reasons. But say more first. Let me just
So, for someone who just want to say, hey, give a word or two about what white-mindedness is, like a simple to a kid. What is it about? White-mindedness is about reasons, and even more, it's about the reasons we think we have, or that appear to us to be the case. So, for example, or not example, the point of white-mindedness is to diagnose a phenomenon of how the status quo of whiteness, of white culture, can literally impact how we think about what is in our best self-interest, what appears to be in our best self-interest. So part of the white-minded problem is that the subject themselves truly believes that they have good reason to do X, Y, and Z. So, for example, I mean, and I do want to say white-mindedness is an analytical tool. So it can be present focused, it could be forwards looking, but it also could be backwards looking. But the backwards looking in the paper, I talk about this, it's a little harder because you're dealing with interpretation. But I still say you can talk about it. So for example, if we want a backwards looking example of an analysis of white-minded, in the paper of the International Black Commonwealth, I call some of the practices of the early, as some people say, classical black nationalists, white-minded. What somebody say, well, how? Well, if you know your history, Paul Cuffey, James Fortin, most of the early black nationalists, classical black nationalists, I'm talking about pre-Liberia, they were heavy capitalists. And the thing about it is, this is where the white-mindedness comes in. It's like built into the culture that they're engaging with. Yeah. It is in their best self, or it appears to be in their best self-interest at that time, to go about. Now, in retrospect, when we're looking back, we're like, dang, man, y'all could have been a little bit more, because we have all this history to back us up. But this is the point where it's like, white culture is so sneaky about how it sneaks into our cognition, how it sneaks into our consciousness, and then after it does that, how it literally informs what we take to be in our best self-interest. And that is the problem of white-mindedness, is how can you get underneath that? How can you think about the reasons of using the reasons so having your practices being grounded on these reasons, but still trying to use the practices to uplift people. Yeah. So I went to Harvard. I studied analytic philosophy, but so that is, to me, that's a white-minded practice. But to me, but I think that a way to overcome that, or how I tried to overcome that in that particular thing, is trying to use the tools of analytic philosophy to uplift my particular black community. And so that's why I tell people too, as much as I call it a problem, I still think it's a descriptive claim. It's not normative immediately. It becomes normative depending on how you use the practices. How did you use logic itself, in terms of first order logic, formal logic, how it's interpreted through the Western tradition. I would consider how it is practiced a white-minded practice, not logic itself, but the practice of logic as it's done here, white-minded. But I still think that you can use this practice to uplift, but you also can use to kick people out of philosophy departments. Yeah. And so that white-mindedness is diagnosing a descriptive phenomenon about reasons, the relationship between cognition and reasons. Yeah. But it also allows for people to take what I call a street disposition and use it for revolutionary purposes. But also they can take it the other way and use it to double down on the status quo.
That brings up a fascinating point, right? I wanna expand on that a bit. So I don't know if you've ever seen that interview that Toni Morrison does with Charlie Rose on the release of Jazz, right?
I don't think I've seen this.
So
give me a little.
So what? Jazz is, one of her many amazing novels, and of course she's thinking about a particular Black community resort, right? That is Black owned. It services a Black middle class, and of course because of segregation in the country, folks are forced to go there. And she says, as part of doing her research, so she's she's in dialogue with Charlie, and she says, part of the resistance to the civil rights movement and integration from some Black communities, especially some, Black business owning individuals, is the fact that if we open up the economy, that means that we're going to run out of business. Right, and so she kind of.
Cruz makes this point too. Yeah.
She and she makes example of so many of these kind of resorts and these getaway spaces that were set up specifically to service African American middle class communities, right? And this, last week we were talking with Dario, and it reminded me of. So he's done some work on the South African Bantustans, right? So South Africa has, within the apartheid state, a set of Bantustans, Gazankulu, KwaZulu, Bafutatswana, Ciskei, Transkei. You've got all of these sort of states within the state of South Africa, right? And the only nation state outside of South Africa that really gives legitimacy and recognition to any of these nation states within South Africa is the state of Israel.
Really?
Right?
That's very interesting.
It is. It is. It's weird and strange, but part of what happens in the 1990s when F.W. de Klerk, pronounces the unbanning of political exilees and political prisoners, he unbans the PAC, he unbans the ANC, he does all of this work. The resistance from some of those heads, quote-unquote heads of state, the likes of Buthelezi, for example, Gajab Buthelezi, Opa Gozo, all of these cats, is they don't want integration. Because integration means that it collapses the sort of Black community that is protected in a way by the structures of the racial economy as it is set up. So I'm curious about how, if we're using the descriptive analytic tool of white-mindedness, does it have a way of explaining to us these two conditions, right? So you have these Black resorts that Toni Morrison is talking about, and you've got these quasi-states in the case of South Africa that are sort of acting as these enclaves, really. And indeed, what often happened, right, and Morrison also sort of raises this, beautifully in the story of Jazz, is that she demonstrates to us exactly that, the fact that, once the integration happened, people stopped going to these Black resorts, and they started to go to places because they could now go anywhere that they wanted because they could afford it in any case, right? Which kind of gives us, as a result, these run-down spaces that nobody no longer visits. Now it becomes sort of, they begin to take in everybody and anybody, even those that they would otherwise not service prior to this moment of integration. So I'm interested in that, right? And when I encountered this particular concept, and just as now you're speaking, I'm thinking precisely about that, to say it's not a normative claim in the immediate sort of step.
A lot of people get that wrong, yeah.
Yeah. How does it help us think through these kinds of experiences where, you have, quote unquote, Black havens, economically, socially, etc., that because of the push to progress, these black havens kind of dissipate.
Yeah, I mean, and so I think this is going to bring up, I guess, the whole purpose behind, post-colonial, decolonial thought and black power thought, black nationalist thought. Here's the thing, how I see it. So one of the problems with the tools coming from critical theory historically is that they've always, in some ways, had a pretty good class analysis. So, for example, Marxism it requires and it advocates for a working class solidarity across races, genders, and things like that. As a matter of fact, a lot of the early black nationalists, Garveyite black nationalists, they were kicked out of the Communist Party because the white communists would call them counter-revolutionary because they wanted a racial. They wanted racial pride. They didn't want to give up their black culture of resistance. Capitalism, if we could call it a theory, is really a structure. But it, to me, how I look at it, it requires or it advocates for bourgeoisie solidarity, whether capitalist solidarity or petty bourgeoisie solidarity, like the teachers and the academics, whatever. The problem is that when it comes to racialized resistance, and I'm thinking for black people, even Asian, whatever, is how does this class solidarity scheme, however you look at it, make sense for a population that is, when they do assimilate into these structures, is these structures are built to erase the masses of those populations. So it'll take a couple of individuals out. A couple of individuals can go to those middle-class cafes. A couple of individuals in the working class case, for the Marxist case, they can become vanguards, intellectuals, but everybody can't come. So that's true for Marxism or capitalism. And so these enclaves or these counter publics that Morrison talks about, they were in practice trying to address what self-determination for black people and racial people can look like despite these broader class structures.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that they were trying to give a practical response to dealing with the problem of having either trying to have a way to be accepted within the class scheme, but also creating conditions where more than just a few individuals can be a part of this thing. And I think that that's more or less what self-determination for racialized people comes down to.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we situate ourselves in a class culture of domination of capitalism more so, but even if you're in a social state of like two classes, political elites, non-elites, how do we situate ourselves in that and still maintain a self-determination role where we can pull the masses of our people along too? And I think that those were attempts, but the class features are so seductive, where it's like, at the end of the day, man, it's hard. It's not hard, but it's more trouble for someone to try to keep up the self-determination thing and trying to adhere to whatever class role they're doing than just saying, forget about it, man. I'm gonna just go myself and my family, and we're gonna go in and we're gonna integrate as best we can. I'm sorry to say, people take the easy way out, and I can't say I blame them, but that's part of the prudential reason. They feel like it's in their best self-interest.
Yeah.
That's what makes it white-minded.
Yeah.
But resisting is this back and forth, though. I think, not just in the moment synchronically, but also diachronically. So I actually think that we need more of that kind of stuff just to put more test on the white supremacist thing. Some people might see it as, unduly separatist, but that's the only way we can at least let the status quo know that we're still here and we still care about our people.
Now, amongst these white-minded 19th and early 20th century intellectuals, you include W.E. Du Bois, Paul Cuffey, Edward Blyden, Alexander Crummell, and Martin Delany. you make this claim in view of the assimilationist propositions. And to a certain extent, you've kind of already touched on this, right? In your previous remarks right now, where you're like, there's the seduction of, quote unquote, upward social mobility, right? In the sense of the moment we open these economies and we get to live anywhere, we get to travel anywhere we want. Certain individuals have access, right? But not everybody. Certain individuals have access. And I'm interested in to a certain extent, the reason why I'm fascinated by your work is for the reason that basically you're saying what everybody's kind of thinking but doesn't want to confront and say.
Yeah.
Right? We all don't want to say it.
Yeah.
But we're all thinking it. We're all like, this is a curiosity. So I'm We've already distinguished that the notion of white-mindedness is not a normative claim in and of itself. It's just, it's a descriptive tool, as you say. It's an analytic descriptive tool. But to a certain extent, I find that you're tugging, maybe it's just a personal intuition, I don't know, but there is a certain sense of once I get a full picture, as it is described by white-mindedness, I can then make a value judgment.
Yeah. It allows that. Yeah, it allows that. Yeah.
Right? So, and I find this complicated because in the South African tradition, for example, I have similar figures to the, Edward Blyden's, Alexander Crummell, and Martin Delaney's. I have examples that I can speak to, and some of us, and this is just a curious thing. So, my grandfather was a school headmaster, right? And he then sort of insists on my maternal side. He insists that all his kids. I remember my mom one time. As we grow older, we sort of get to know our parents as people, not as parents.
Yeah.
And my mother says to me on this one day, we were having a really curious conversation. And she was like, I wanted to be in the army.
Huh.
And I laughed. I couldn't stop myself. I laughed because I was like, I could never envision that, right? I could never see my mother as a soldier, right, in the resistance army of the ANC or the PAC for that matter. And she was like, I did. But your granddad, my father, refused to allow me to go join the guerrilla combatants either in Namibia or Angola. He said to me, I need to go to school, I need to get a degree, I need to become a teacher, right? And what that kind of did, not what it kind of did, what it has done is that it has resulted in my own family, the creation of, I often say to folks, in South Africa, we have this phenomenon of first-generation graduates.
I see.
Black graduates specifically. And I would say I am a third-generation graduate, right? Because there is this culture of reading, et cetera, et cetera. So the point that I'm making is that when I take this tool that you're giving me and I read the situation, I kind of find myself sitting with a bit of a curiosity and ambivalence, right? Even in terms of my own family history, because of the normative judgments that this tool facilitates in the sense of the kinds of decisions that intergenerationally we have made. That have produced, for example, in me, a 28-year-old academic who finds himself at one of the oldest historically black universities on the continent, but also kind of in these global spaces of the likes of your Harvard universities, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no shying away from the fact that the way the actions have resulted in very material realities, right? So when I'm thinking about, for example, as you indicate, your W.E. Du Bois, your Paul Coffey's, your Edward Blyden's as white-minded, I'm curious about how I can treat them systematically without giving the value judgment prematurely or immaturely.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna sound like an academic here, but I mean, there's a method in philosophy called, it's a big word, but it's a simple idea, called phenomenology.
Yeah.
Which is one of the hallmarks of phenomenology is the theorists attempting to take on the subjective standpoint, or whatever the case be. And I think that I want to pair that with another comment. One thing I tell people when I teach ethics, if you look in Aristotle's ethics, what's interesting is Aristotle thought that you couldn't judge whether or not a man was happy until his life was over. It was interesting. He don't. In any episodic thing, Aristotle didn't think you could apply the concept of happiness to a person until you actually knew how the life fully unfolded. I think this is in like chapter 4, chapter 5 of his Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics. And I always found that interesting because for Plato, the good life is having your soul in order. So you can very much judge that subjective thing based on the person themselves can judge it. So I'm relating this because.
And of course, I want to sort of expand here on that point of Plato, because Plato sort of gives you, in the Republic, sort of a way in which one can make that individual judgment of oneself, that subjective judgment, through this kind of processual training and disciplining of the soul. Right.
This virtuous education, things.
Yeah.
Being in the right political structure. I call it kinship networks. Being in relation to right kin and stuff. In community discourse. So, but my thing is here. So when a reader, this is the role of the theorists when they're looking at the history of like Paul, Edward Blyth, and W.B. Du Bois. We're the reader. When they're trying to take this white-minded analytic tool and assess the different practices that they were doing, how you would have situated white-minded, non-white-minded, whatever, or white-minded, revolutionary. You carve out the value judgments and the non-value judgments through attempting to imagine what it was like to have to make those practices in that particular context. So, for example, I mean, I think that I tell people this all the time. People hate this view, but I first started talking about this to illustrate to Morehouse students. I was teaching at Morehouse for a little bit before I came to BU during the pandemic about the Haitian Revolution. So, on my reading of the Haitian Revolution, nobody has this reading. It's like the Haitian Revolution for me was white-minded. Okay, some people say, how, Professor P? How? So we was just talking about class structures, right? But nation-stateism is a kind of class structure. It's a kind. This is how we get locutions like the global north and the global south and things like that. So for me, the Haitian Revolution was white-minded to the extent that the leaders of the Haitian Revolution and the Haitian public in general wanted to be a part of the European economic structure and nation-state structure, to the extent they started identifying as Haitian nation-state identity instead of just black. Okay, what's the difference then? Okay, if you look at the Maroons in Jamaica, for example, what I think Haiti should have kept revolting. It should have until all black people in the diaspora were free in Panama and Florida, because in Florida we had Maroons in Florida at the time the Haitian Revolution was kicking out. It should have kept the revolution going and never desired to be part of the Western structure. Never desired to want to trade with France. Never desired to want to stay with Britain. We trying to set up our own things, our own enclaves over here, but it's not just the nation state of Haiti. And we still inheriting these problems now in the diaspora. We got these culture wars going on in the black community in America, where everybody in the black community has a nation state identity they're trying to hang on to, and not knowing that what makes it white-minded is because they're supporting the status quo of empire.
Yeah.
And so, even something as seemingly revolutionary like the Haitian Revolution, how we read it, when you take the white-minded lens and you think about the other possibilities, and you think about the other actors like the Maroons, it could have went differently if the desires and the values were differently of those people. Similarly, I say the same thing about W.B. Du Bois and Garvey. Garvey says several times that he wanted to be the Napoleon of Africa. That is white-minded to the extent you're trying to take these concepts from the Western structure and in a good deed of helping your people, but you're doing it with the wrong reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, white-mindedness allows you to reveal some of the propaganda that's even involved in our education of some of these figures. And one of the claims I make is that if they were here, some of them would at least say some of their practice was white-minded, as I do myself. When I have retrospect, like, dang, man, that freshman year, that sophomore year in Morehouse, I did a lot of white-minded stuff then. I couldn't see it at the time. That maybe if I would have been in community, I could have had a consciousness raising. Yeah. But so what I'm saying, the same thing I do in my reading of Du Bois and the Haitian Revolution, I do to myself, my own life.
So there's this kind of self-reflexivity, right? Now, and I've already sort of intimated toward this to say that I find this fascinating because, I find similar cats in the South African context. And in the South African context, I'm critical. So this is one of the folks that I work on. I worked on him in terms of my doctoral, but I also work on him for a forthcoming book of mine. And this is the figure of William Wellington Gopa. And in 1885, he gives us the only text that he writes in English, and he delivers this as a speech to the Lovedale Literary Society. Everything else that he does it's done in isiXhosa. And he comes to the conclusion that, and I'm quoting here from him, thinking about, radicalizing this notion of white-mindedness and sort of getting to that secondary position of making those normative claims or that normative judgment. He says, "May the day come when we natives of this country shall have altogether been freed from the power of heathenism in all its forms, and when we in turn shall willingly and out of the same love that prompted the Britons to sacrifice everything for Christ's sake, do the same for our benighted countrymen." Now, what do you say to the proposition that this set of intellectuals was appealing to the white consciousness by attempting to demonstrate that they too can reason as the white race? Because, of course, we've got to think about the fact that these folks were sort of at the receiving end of delegitimating claims that say, you folks can't think, you folks can't reason, you folks can't. And in the South African context, what I find really, really fascinating as well is that, as I say, we get the printing press in 1823, and there are a number of iterations of the press because, by the way, black folks are like, we're destroying this thing because it's changing our world, right? So I think there were 3 destructions of the Lovedale Literary Press.
Wow. 3?
Yeah. So it was burnt 3 times before it comes up again finally and lasts all the way to the 20th century in 1863. So for 40 years, there's this kind of to and fro war between the Glasgow Missionary Society and the natives in the wars that are iterative, right? In the frontier wars. And in the frontier wars, all the time, the press gets destroyed. Right? Now, these folks are, what I'm thinking about in terms of the black intellectuals is that for Gopa to make this claim, for example, to say that may the day soon come when we natives shall have been freed from heathenism, I read him generously in the first instance, because I do read him critically as well. But in the first reading, I read him generously to say he's attempting to, for example, get work out in terms of get stuff published. And so he has to sort of pander to white interests. So how do we deal with black folk, both historically and contemporarily, who will play into particular structures of oppression, domination, and injustice as a way of sort of sitting on the fence, right? So on the one hand, I'm playing the system in order to get work out. On the other hand, I'm playing the system because I do derive benefits from the system. Because, the black intellectuals, they occupy a particularly distinguished role, be it in the case of the United States of America or in the case of South Africa, right? Black intellectual is... So I'm curious about that, to say, how do we read that?
I mean, so... This actually would help reveal, I think, what's so different about the Haitian Revolution moment. I mean, it's at a certain point. I mean, I can't speak for South Africa. I'm not a scholar on that context, but there's a certain point in each context of black resistance, where the white supremacy materially is just so entrenched. So so in this case, we talked about even now there is until we get totally organized in our resistance, there is just a kind of inevitability that certain individuals some of us are going to have interface with these institutions and these resources.
Yeah.
Now, as I say, that practice itself is descriptive. It is white-minded. But what I think is, in terms of the usage part, if you're in that situation, whether in that context or now, you have to look at how that particular individual is engaged with their kinship networks back. So, there's this famous book in black studies literature and a movie called A Spook Who Sat by the Door. A black guy from Detroit, I believe, either Detroit or Chicago, I can't remember, infiltrates the CIA, goes undercover, and takes some of the counterinsurgency tools of the CIA and takes it back to Detroit, Chicago, whichever city, and starts a black revolution. Now, the point at which the person was actually getting indoctrinated in that CIA thing, I'm sure, even when I watch him, I'm like, wow, man, that man is selling out. He's selling out. He's going, he's taking it on. But then the intention and the use and the association with the kin that he had in mind, to me, cancels out the bad normative judgment on the practice. And so I think that is one way we have to be charitable for people who work in the day, because it's just that this is how the Afro-pessimist is, right? The white supremacist structure at this point, and even seems like at that point, which is so invasive and envelops all of our material practices, some of us have to engage with that with the sense of taking back. Now, the problem is most of us, I would say most or a lot of us, get there and we fall asleep and we start loving the gifts of being in that space and being away from our community. And then also, I guess the extreme disappointing part of that is when we actively play roles to not allow other people to get the benefits, other people from our kinship network to get the benefits, and so we become gatekeepers. And we totally are. We are an embodied tool,
for sure,
of the white-minded status quo structure.
But I think what happens in that context. I think that there's a rude awakening. Right? So the assumption of the role of the gatekeeper gives us this very, very rude awakening kind of thing. And here, for example, I think of the work of Tiosoga. And Tiosoga is married, of course, to a white Scottish woman. He's one of the first black ministers in the country. And he's remembered for his contribution to the popularization of the Christian faith among black folk in the country and the conversion project. And this is what he says, right, as a way of sort of this rude awakening. He says to his kids, in a letter to his kids, one of the letters to his children, he says, "I want you for your own future comfort to be very careful on this point. You will ever cherish the memory of your mother as that of an upright, conscientious, thrifty Christian Scotch woman. You will ever be thankful for your connection by this tie to the white race," right? Even that concept is curious. "But if you wish to gain credit for yourselves, if you do not wish to feel the taunt of men, which you sometimes may be made to feel, take your place in the world as colored, not as white men, as Kaffirs, not as Englishmen." And I'm using the concepts as he uses them here. So simply, how do we understand the role of what you term assimilation in your work on the Black Commonwealth, with strategies of survival that historical black intellectuals had to deploy in order to get access to resources that would alternatively be furthering objectives maybe of racial liberation, be it in the United States or in contexts like South Africa. So I'm interested in that, to say, because in your paper you kind of give us two propositions really that give us a real cool kind of solution of the problems of race, oppression, and injustice. You talk about non-assimilationist and non-segregationist, non-separatist, thinking. So I'm thinking about, again, I'm just sort of pressing you here on this notion of even contemporarily, right? The gatekeepers that you're talking about, the folks who turn into these people who gate out particular communities. How do we think of them? Because, as you say, a lot of them start off by saying, okay, I'm doing this because I want to funnel resources back into my community.
Siphon,
right?
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But they sort of get into these roles, and these roles become seductive. They've got access to the money, to the good housing in the suburban areas, to the fancy cars, to the good schools for their children. And so there are all of these reasons, as you said, that the root of white-mindedness becomes the reasons for, but I need this for my kids to have better opportunities. I need this, I need that, I need that. And at the end of the day, folks come up against a very rude awakening, as we see it in Diosoga's writing, right? So he says, he advises his children explicitly. He says to them, and this is in the 1860s, right? He says to them, I'm dying. And in my death, the only thing that I will leave you with, aside of the wealth and the wealth, of course, is intellectual wealth, et cetera, et cetera. But aside from all of that, the one thing that I want to, the wealth that I will really give you is the fact of calling you to the consciousness of that, the fact that whiteness will never accept you. Your mother was a Scotswoman, sure, you have that affinity, but they will never accept you. So how do we deal with that? Folks who are, because I think, to a point, if I'm looking at the work of Frantz Fanon, for example, Black Skin, White Mask, the fact that Diosoga takes a white woman as a wife says something psychoanalytically deep about the process and this project of being invested in, be it Christianity, be it the structures that exist. There's a deep investment.
Yes,
but on his deathbed, he says, maybe I might have been wrong.
I might have been wrong, yeah. Okay, so here's the thing. So I'm actually going to start with a non-black case, but still a racialized case. So I had a student who was from Hong Kong, and I teach white-mindedness and some of my stuff in critical theory, and I promise this is going to make a point. He came to my office and we literally talked for 3 hours because he himself could not report to me, according to his own standards, anything about his cultural experience in Hong Kong that wasn't white-minded. And so that was freaking him out because so part of the white-minded script is like, once people realize that, they start looking back in their life like, dang, what is my culture? Like, what is me? What is authentic to a thing apart? All my identity is tied up into things I've inherited from the white structure. And so, yeah, you're right. So he had a crisis. He had an existential crisis because it was revealed to him. So white-mindedness actually kind of gets you to that social depth before the actual, this guy, he's actually dying, but it gets you to a social depth because you know the word. Now you're thinking like, oh, shit. Excuse my language. What do I do? And but my thing is, the situation of assimilation and non-assimilation is much harder than the political question of separatism. So that's how I see it. Separatism and non-separatism, that's a straightforward political point. You want to separate territorially and through a political arrangement. But assimilation is much harder because of the stuff that it's about. It's about cultural stuff, primarily aesthetic. So in some ways, Du Bois, he was always, in my opinion, always a burning black nationalist, but his aesthetic was so committed to that German Hegelian academy. He was committed to that. And it affected in what he thought was, at least early Du Bois, on how he thought about what was in his best self-interest, him and black people. So this aesthetic, for me, is, what you're committed to in terms of style and things like that, but also your dating preferences. Does that, I'm glad we get into this, but does that black man, when he walks into that white space with that white wife, is that, or white partner, whatever, it doesn't really matter, your sexual orientation, does that give them some kind of capital? Do they feel like it do? Maybe, whether it's objectively true or not, it could be objectively true that it gives a capital, but do they feel like it do? And so that's an aesthetic problem. That's a problem about values and what you see as beautiful. Okay, but also one of the other hard nodes is the economic culture. One of the, I think, biggest questions is it white-minded to participate in capitalism given its historical connection to European domination? That's a question I'm dealing with in the paper. How do we work? How do we work through that? Now, what I've noticed though in the history is that, to your point, this person's point too. Most people, let's take a guy, a black man who worked at Wall Street for 30 years. No, actually, I go with a bigger case. I met a guy who at Harvard Business School. He came up to me with that thing, and he said, "Man, I'm so envious." Of who? I was like, "For me?" He was like, "Yeah." He said, "Because I wish I didn't have to dress like these people, talk like these people." And I admire your freedom. I admire your, now, my liberty, my street disposition. And so what I was picking up though from him is like he was hurting inside. He was hurting. He was dying inside because he felt like he was trapped into a thing that he knew wasn't right. He knew was disconnecting him from his people, his language. But he still felt like it was worth the sacrifice.
To be involved in that.
To be involved in that.
So deeply.
Right. And it wasn't an irrational sacrifice because the reasons that the sacrifice was based on was presented to him as being in his best self-interest. And so I think that the problem of assimilation is a far bigger problem, because even people who say, hey, they talk loosely about, oh, we just gonna go get our own land, we're gonna go do our own thing. But are you still committed to the markets? Are you still committed to the consumerist products, to the mediums that you consume in all your information about your identity? The only group I think historically that have gotten a little bit, did the best at totally trying to be non-assimilationists in practice are some of the maroon societies, particularly the best examples in Jamaica. But even that, the cultural capitalism is encroaching on them. I just read a couple of things about them dealing with corporations trying to take their land and things like that. So the self-determination problem is coming back again, even for people who totally want to check out.
And fantastic way to sort of lead into the next aspect, which is the notion of non-separatist ideology that allows us to work against assimilationist frameworks and thinking, right? So in your argument, and I'm still dealing with that paper, International Black Commonwealth, in your argument, this is what you're after. And I'm interested in what it might look like, as you say, working within the confines of economic structures, that is capitalism, that we exist in. So what I really liked about what you did in that paper was to say it's an acknowledgement of this exact point, right? Is to say that we can't check out completely because the market forces, and to a certain extent, if I'm reading you correctly, you please feel free to correct me here, but there's a point in which in that paper, towards the end of it, in any case, you even suggest that actually maybe it's not in our best interest, using Robinson's point, it's not in our interest to check out of the capitalist system because our music, our culture,
inventions,
all of it is what props up this system, right? Yeah. So what could fund, as you propose, this Black Commonwealth, this Black International Commonwealth, is a form of reparations, right? So sort of this getting back the rights to all of that, be it the music, the literature, the inventions, the patents, etc., getting that back. So I'm fascinated because to a certain extent, if I'm reading you correctly, and again, please feel free to object here. I don't want to sort of contort your argument, but it's basically what I'm getting from your work is the proposition that we've got to sort of figure out the conditions of possibility. And once we've figured out the conditions of possibility, find the weak points wherein we can leverage.
Good.
And part of that starts off by confronting the white-mindedness and delaying the normative judgment, right? So it's neither to say this is good or bad, whether we're white-minded or not, because that's not the point. The point is to get the picture, to describe the picture. And once we've described the picture, understand what are the leverage points.
Yeah, the strategy, how we can develop strategy. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm always thinking about the theorist, the organizer, and the participant. And so this paper is an expression of that. So I want to say a couple of preliminary things. I think this is the only proposal out there to advocate for reparations for diasporic people and continental Africans. A corrective justice framework ran through the private sector. So it's not nation state based. This is what makes the proposal unique, I think. This is also what makes all my socialist friends and Marxist friends call me white-minded and say, well, you see what I'm saying? Like, because I'm a capitalist. And so it's different from, I think, anything that's out there, because it's saying that, no, hey, look, we can get reparations from the corporate entities that have exploited our art, our inventions, and our being of culture. And so, I mean, just even the African case, think about the African art market. Millions and millions of dollars of cultural products that belong to indigenous African communities. Can we get a piece of that? Can we get a piece of that to fund it? So this International Black Commonwealth, I'm indebted to chiefly Cedric Robinson, who has a short paper where he proposes this idea, but the problem with that paper is that he puts the burden of funding the Commonwealth on black communities.
Okay. Yes.
On black communities. He says every black person needs to give a 1% contribution. My response to that is, how are we going to do that when we're cash strapped? The Federal Reserve in America just did a study a few years ago that says that the average black net worth in Boston, which is one of the richest cities in the country and the world, is $8. The average net worth for a white person is over $240,000. Okay, if we're in one of the richest cities in the richest countries and the black net worth is $8, how you think it's going to look in Mariana, Florida, for example? Or in South Africa? And so I say, hey, look, I like your idea, but we need another way to fund this. So I go to people like Harold Cruz, who talks about, hey, look, we've been exploited by the publishing companies. If we could get that revenue back, that could be something to help with black self-determination. We don't have to be dependent on white patronage and white philanthropy. And then also, people don't like him. I have mixed feelings about him, but since we're on air, I'm just going to be honest. I have to give him his credit. Part of this project was inspired by the public intellectual/comedian known as Umar Johnson. He says in a very, people gloss over him, but a broken clock is right twice a day, I guess. He says things. He says the thing. He's like, look, hyperbolic, but he says if we could get the ownership of all the black art, music, whatever, visual art, black patents, black inventions, we could have enough money to fund a Black Wall Street in every city in this country. So look, that's hyperbolic, but I took that spirit and I said, okay, that's a pretty good idea. Okay, it actually answers a question that Robinson doesn't have an answer for. And so this Corrective Black Commonwealth is a way to provide basic resources and aid to black communities in any kind of nation state. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, Panama, whatever, even nation states within Africa that's being let down by their nation state. And so if we had this Commonwealth, the way that we would have a way to lobby corporations for aspects of their portfolios, they own it, whatever, music portfolios, to get pieces of that capital coming back to black communities. So a part of this is going to involve a lot of lobbying strategies, working with corporations to let them know, hey, look, for example, if you got Marvin Gaye catalog, let us, if you own that private hedge fund, private equity fund, for 5 years, let the Black Commonwealth lease some of those songs. And so every time a white person or a non-black person turns on a Marvin Gaye song on Spotify, some of that proceeds is going back to the black community. You can do that for any kind of art project or any kind of patent project. And that's what I think makes it a unique way. And then also I want to say this, the reason why I do not like the nation state-based reparations programs is because people don't know their history. Any time in the history of this, particularly the U.S., the white public has felt like the nation state of America has doing something for black people, it always ends in terrorism. So I'm trying to sneak in reparations through the private sector. So
without endangering black communities.
Exactly. And then a passport feature. I just want to throw that in there. We need a way for black communities, so when this thing go down, black people can just have free reign to any supermajority black country, and we can just walk into it.
This is also true. And to a certain extent, it's already sort of, I think Ghana had proposed it a couple of years ago.
We're starting to think like that because we see these structures failing us.
And they had sort of also kind of proposed it in relation specifically to the African American community, I believe it was. And this was back before the pandemic, actually. It was 2019, right?
Yeah.
Where such a proposal was actually kind of bandied about, but it seems it didn't necessarily materialize.
We need an international black passport. I just want to throw that there. We need that. We need that.
We do, because, and I think it would make for a lot more. But the problem, of course, Darian, is that even on the continent at the moment, right, we've got the East African countries, the East African bloc that's beginning to introduce an East African passport. The rest of us, West Africa, the SADC community, Southern African Development Community, we are so fragmented. And we are fragmented because of the inheritance of the colonial legacies, right? Talking in episode 5 to Teddy Mazina, we were thinking exactly about that, right? He's a photojournalist and an artist, and we were thinking precisely about some of the major challenges that we are facing on the continent as a result of the inventions. So to go back to V.Y. Mudimbe's work, The Inventions of Africa, it's precisely that. We are still reeling from ethnic, cultural, linguistic inventions that continue to separate us. But that's gonna take us, of course, because I want to come back. As you say, the work that you're doing in the Black Commonwealth sort of pivots from the work of Robinson's view, and you highlight that his framework is useful for us when you write that, for starters, it accepts that as a nation, Black people are contained within existing nation states, and that any political vehicle established to aid Black people internationally would have to work around this entrenchment. To motivate this point, he cites India's violation of the United Nations Preserve of Domestic Jurisdiction principle as a historic precedent of authentic movements of supranationalism germinating. This violation happened in 1946, and you use a really curious and cool example here of the Indian government that filed a complaint on behalf of the ethnic Indians living in South Africa who received unfair treatment from the South African government. Now, this point is well taken, but undercut by the realities of what preceded it and what follows after it, right? So, for example, in the case of the South African Gandhi, which was penned by Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Vahid, the reader is privy to the incredibly racist thinking of Gandhi in the South African context, and that book came out in 2015. In what follows, in 1984, the tricameral assembly established by the apartheid state continues to exclude the majority by granting representation to the colored Indian and Indian population. So you had 3 houses, a white house, a colored house, and an Indian house, without the inclusion of the Black majority, right? And in the contemporary age, you have 34 Black bodies killed in 2021 in the Phoenix Massacre, when there was the uprisings both in KZN and Gauteng. So I'm interested in this, in the sense of there's a possibility, yes, for racial solidarity in contexts like South Africa, or rather, is there a possibility for racial solidarity where the historical realities locate the majority in the category of lesser than? And I don't want to use the concept of human, because human already comes with a lot of baggage but for example, in the apartheid state, we have these 4 ethnic groups. We've got Indian, colored, white, and Black, right, in the apartheid state. And we inherit and we continue with these categories, by the way, post-apartheid in the democratic era. Now, there have been propositions, for example, under the United Democratic Movement, which was an anti-apartheid resistance movement, that said that we have to have multi-ethnic solidarity. But this kind of stuff that we see here, again, Rob, and I'm citing this because you're using Robinson's work, and you say this is a cool example and this is a cool way to kind of organize, and to also think about these ideas in a multiplicity of ways, supranationally, as you say. But I'm curious about whether there is the possibility for inter-ethnic solidarity in situations where, even in 2021, 34 Black brothers and sisters were killed. In Phoenix, in Durban, in KwaZulu-Natal, in South Africa, because the Indian population found this the Black folks in their communities to be suspicious of wanting to commit crimes during the 8 days of unrest, of political unrest in the country.
Yeah. I will say it's not on black people to reach out to non-black people to be in solidarity with them. We've tried to do that in this history of liberalism. So, in terms of, we say, this phrase, the ball is in their court. The ball is in their court. Part of the Commonwealth spirit is, hey, look, since they haven't cared about our interests and wanted to aid us, white people or just any non-black group, more or less. Now, I'm not talking about particular instance, individual, more or less. Then we need to take it upon ourselves to set up institutions and structures where we're not asking, we're taking, not violently, but we're going to mold the reasons of white-mindedness to show corporations why it's in their best capitalist consumer interest to work with us, and so we're going to twist some arms. And so my thing is that the Commonwealth idea sees it has this optimistic spirit, but really it's coming from a spirit of pessimism and a spirit of like, hold up. I can't really trust that these other non-black nation states, non-black people, are going to accept black people for who they are. They're not. Most of them are not accepting the black population they already have. And because I can't trust them, I have to try to look for ways black solidarity can work without causing people to want to terrorize the communities, and then also the government to want to dismantle us. And so, I'm very pessimistic about multi-ethnic solidarity when it comes to black people. And again, this is what I do think the Afro-pessimists are right about. It's not just, I personally don't tie anti-blackness to white supremacy. Anti-blackness is a feature that, if you look in the history of even pre-modernity, with the Arab slave trade and things like that, I mean, I don't know how you want to count modernity with the Arabs, but the Arab slave trade is a good example of anti-blackness before white structures got started. And so, I think anti-blackness is a bigger problem, a far bigger problem than climate change. It's a far bigger problem. So, because until we get that on board, we're gonna leave out a whole population who could help us organize to save the planet. Yeah. And then also, I want to end with Du Bois. Du Bois says, what is whiteness for Du Bois? Ownership forever and ever and ever of the earth. He says that in The Souls of White Folks in the essay. And so, well, if that's the stance of the enemy, then I gotta start protecting my home.
Yeah. In conclusion, Darren, I this conversation can go on forever, but I am interested in the question of, for example, do you see a potential for global discourses of blackness that account for the situational specificities of each context? So, and this is, and I ask this question in relation to what the Black Archive Visual Podcast has attempted to do, right? So, in my arrival in the United States, I kind of am sitting with an existential angst of there isn't a cool dialogic happening between the continent and African American intellectuals, right?
It's true.
And so I'm curious about whether in our theoretical developments, whether in our grassroots organizing, and of course the grassroots organizing can be, and you demonstrate this quite well in Epistemic Detachment, in that paper on Epistemic Detachment and Political Action, where you showcase that, you have something happening in one particular part of the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, it catches on and becomes an entire movement in another part of the country. So whether it be in the United States, whether it be on the African continent, is there a way for us to formulate, number one, dialogue? And I think for me, the last serious inter-black exchange was edited and curated in that debate, Black Literature and Literary Culture, that came out in 1989 with Henry Louis Gates, Skip.
Yeah.
Where he does.
Is Wally Schrenk in that one?
I believe he is.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm familiar with that. Yeah, I love. Shout out Wally Schrenk. I love him.
Yeah. That was the last kind of, for me, a serious conversation, a genuinely serious debate of exchange. And yes, sure, it's happening in literature, and some folks critique literature for its abstractions and so forth and so on. But that was for me the last serious conversation. Otherwise, we do have discussions that are happening back and forth, but like a genuine, deep intellectual exchange in '89 was the last I saw of it. And the vision maybe that I have as a result, or what comes out of this project, the Black Archive Visual Podcast, is to inaugurate a conversation that looks like what Skip and his colleagues did all those years ago. So is it possible, do you believe it possible to inaugurate a intercontinental Black solidarity debate, be it on the continent or in the United States, and also Southern Americas as well, South Americas,
you gotta have it there.
West Indies, Jamaica, you name it, right? So global, a genuine global conversation that accounts for each of our specificities, but at the same time aspires to a global solidarity.
I'm more hopeful about that project than the multi-ethnic. Not having solidarity. It's a hard deal. I'm more promising, but I do think here's the two conditions that's going to have to be done. One, everyone who is being oppressed by appearing Black has to want to be Black. Okay, this is a problem with our Dominican brothers and sisters, Cape Verdean brothers and sisters, where the world sees us as Black, but they don't really know if they want to be Black. So we got to figure that out. We got to get on one accord about our desires to be Black, not in a malicious way, but just in a sense of where I know that you here with me, we the same thing. Another thing is that though we have to change the way we talk about Blackness. So this is a problem you see in the you hear this locution in America, diaspora wars, because there's a thing where people are unsure about how to carve out their cultural attachment within a racial thing. So what I'm saying is, one of my big things in my book that I'm working on called Street Knowledge is I advocate for so Blackness is a condition for me. It's not. I don't believe in terms of a racial thing. I want to get away from a racialized conception of Blackness and have a conditional conception, so we can talk about particular cultural groups within the Black condition. And I use the word kinship networks. So, for example, what you want is a way for, if at whatever point any particular Black person or a group of Black people start feeling that a particular cultural script does not fit them, but they still are within the condition of Blackness, they can reject it, and then they can have a way to talk about their own individual thing that they're talking about. So the X Kinship Network, the Y Kinship Network. And so you can have a way to talk about the difference without it being hostile. Yes.
The disagreements, being able to hold the disagreements within Blackness.
And allow for things to develop too. Even in America, there may be it may get so fine-grained that we start talking about regional identities of Blackness in North Florida versus, New England. I think that kind of stuff matters because it impacts the way you see your values, what you need. We need different things as rural Southern Black people than a Black person in Boston, and vice versa. So we just need a way to be able to a better way to be able to talk about difference while still acknowledging the condition, the common condition.
Darian Pollock, professor of philosophy at Boston University. Folks, thank you. I just want to thank you so much for the generosity and also for your time and sitting with us. I wish you all the best of luck with that book project. I'm very excited to see it come out.
We're gonna get in Africa. Huh?
Yes, we have to.
You're gonna help me with that.
We absolutely have to. I'd love to. Before we started, I said I'd love to launch the book in South Africa when it's done and out. And I'm interested as well to see how your thought develops, Darian, over the coming years, right?
I might change my mind.
you might, maybe you might. You'll double down. You never know. But I genuinely appreciate this conversation and your time. To our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. I am Sisego Kumalo, your host. I look forward to welcoming you again next week to another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. See you next week.